And Zach, what would you say are the most common risk factors in ground improvement projects, and how do you kind of address these early in the project lifecycle to prevent costly issues down the road?
The biggest issues is the unknowns. Being in the ground improvement industry, you're really always able to see the surface, plus maybe some things that are provided to you through things such as geotechnical reports or Google Earth aerial views of what may have been there in the past. So really the big part there of mitigating risk is trying to figure out what the
One of the biggest pitfalls of AEC project managers is that they don't do enough risk planning on their projects. Risks are inherent in every project you work on in architecture, engineering, and construction. And if you're not accounting for them, they will come back to bite you, and they will put your project over budget and over schedule. In today's episode, I have with me Zack Kovacs. Zack is the Regional Operations Manager at Menard USA. Zack works on very large ground improvement projects, and he's going to talk about how he plans for and deals with risks on his projects, and we're going to tie them back to how you can apply some of the same strategies to yours. I'm Anthony Fasano, and this is the AEC Project Management Podcast. Let's jump right in. All right, now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. Zack Kovacs is a Regional Operations Manager at Menard USA. Zack, welcome to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Zack, to kick things off here, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up doing what you're doing at Menard? Take us a little bit through your career journey.
Sure. So, initially, I chose to go down the civil engineering path just as some family members with within my family that had some engineering background, some also engineering tangent background in the blue collar industry. Plus, then between that and just the idea of building things while also playing in the dirt really inspired me to go down that path of civil engineering.
Awesome. So, in terms of what we're going to focus on here today, Zack does a lot of work in the kind of ground improvement project space, and we're going to focus on that. But also, what we're going to try to pull out of it for you is things that will apply to all projects, whether you're in engineering, architecture, construction. And Zack, what would you say are the most common risk factors in ground improvement projects, and how do you kind of address these early in the project lifecycle to prevent costly issues down the road?
Sure. So some of the biggest issues is the unknowns. Being in the ground improvement industry, you're really always able to see the surface, plus maybe some things that are provided to you through things such as geotechnical reports or Google Earth aerial views of what may have been there in the past. So really the big part there of mitigating risk is trying to figure out what is the ultimate risk of the unknowns.
Yeah, right. Trying to figure out what that risk factor is.
Yeah, at least trying to gauge what is the level of risk associated with the potential unknowns, whether they be soft soils or if they're obstructions, utilities, different things of those natures.
So let's talk about that a little bit. When you're dealing with difficult soil conditions like overly soft or dense materials, how do you kind of balance risk and efficiency?
Sure. So risk and efficiency, ultimately knowing what's there to the best of your abilities through the geotechnical report and having at least some percentage of understanding of what is in the ground is your first step. From there is having a versatile set of equipment fleet, things that can do different types of things, whether that's pre-drilling, different techniques in the ground improvements, stone columns, rigid inclusions, some of the more common items. But the more versatile your fleet, the more you're able to adapt and be flexible to those different types of conditions.
Yeah, that's great. And I think just talking about risk in general for a minute here, one of the things we like to do at EMI, because we work with a lot of companies on building kind of their project management development programs and strategies, is really to go through this risk register process at the beginning of your projects where you're identifying the risks. Kind of to Zach's point, you are rating them in terms of, their probability and their impact. And if you have risks that have a real high probability and a real high impact, those are going to be really critical risks that you're going to want to focus on. So in Zach's example here, he's thinking about the different ways that he can manage those risks, having different equipment on hand to help with them, right? Maybe you might have different experts on hand within your team that you could call for different types of soil situations or ground situations. And so I think in general, regardless of the types of project you manage, again, you might manage an engineering design project or you might manage a construction administration project. Before you start the project, identifying those risks, but also, the impact of those risks is important because not all risks are created equal. And you're probably going to want to spend more time preparing for the risks that are going to be potentially more damaging. So I think that's something for you to keep in mind on your projects. So, Zach, what are some key strategies that you might use to navigate obstructions and underground utilities while still being able to keep your projects on schedule and within budget?
Sure. So as I mentioned a minute ago, there was assessing the different level of risk by reviewing geotechnical reports and also Google Earth. So the geotechnical reports only really give you a very small sample size of the overall project. You can get a little bit of a historical aerial understanding by using those to see what may have been there in the past. If it was a steel mill or an open cornfield, then that might give you an idea of the level of risk associated with those different items. Combine those with the project civil plans and trying to figure out what utilities are in place versus what would be in place in the future. If you have a much more risky site, you could also use things such as ground penetrating radar to get a better idea of what's in the ground, more direct towards the utility aspect. And then when it comes to obstructions, depending on the level of risk, you can come prepared to pre-drill those with various forms of pre-drilling equipment. But ultimately, you need to set up that job to be able to withstand those different risk factors, whether that be the contract or the equipment that you're bringing to the job site.
Yeah, and I think that this is an excellent point when you think about risk prevention, not risk prevention, but risk assessment is any information you can glean, like Zach tells you, the type of, looking at the Google Earth pictures, figuring out what's here, what does that lend from my history in the past on projects like this, right? You can really start to be more prepared for risks. And when it comes to underground utilities, I mean, that's one of your biggest unknowns on probably many projects, not just ground improvement, but even I worked in doing land development and site design. I mean, if you have a water main or a gas main going through your site, you really have to prepare for that. You really have to plan around that because that can cause a lot of issues. You could also get involved with legal issues when it comes to underground utilities, easements, and things of that nature. So to me, utilities are always a red flag when it comes to risks, whether it's ground improvement or any kind of engineering, architecture, construction project. And again, you need to be aware of them and what those impacts might be. And any kind of mapping or information that you can get ahead of time can maybe help you to slightly reduce the risk, or at least how you see that risk.
So the utilities also bring in not only a economic and whatnot risk, but a main safety risk too. Whereas obstructions, those will slow you down and cost you money, but utilities can hurt people if you don't know they're there. So that's a main thing to really
Yeah,
look at with utilities.
absolutely. Especially from a safety perspective, you hit a gas main, that's a real dangerous situation you have going on there. So, Zach, another thing that can be a project delay or project risk on ground improvement projects and really on all projects is supply challenges. So, how do you approach logistics planning to overcome space limitations, equipment needs, and potential material delays, especially when the clock is ticking and, of course, budgets are tight?
Certainly. So those can be major conflicts, especially when you're working on small sites with larger equipment. You just need to have a very good plan in place, a good quality understanding of what our expectations are, the client's expectations are, making sure that both parties understand those expectations are in agreement with the plan moving forward. Everything has to flow in the unison together in order for those things to come out successful. Then also with supply and logistics of equipment, materials, having upfront conversations with those vendors and suppliers is very important. Make sure everybody understands what the expectations are as far as deliveries, the days, the timing, the quantities, And again, like I mentioned before, too, having versatile equipment within our own fleet allows us our own flexibility in order to determine what needs to go there. If you can do different things with different equipment, then it does open you up to some flexibility.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point because to me, one of the best solutions for risk is flexibility, right? Because if there are unknowns on your project and unknowns of what you're going to deal with, the more potential solutions you have on hand can help you to deal with those risks, right? For an example, if you're going to go do a project in your a home improvement project in your house and you want to, you know, fix something, if you bring a toolbox with 2 tools in it versus a toolbox with 10 tools in it, chances are you're going to go there with 2 tools and say, "Oh man, I wish I had this, that, or the other tool." So, when it comes to project management, if you have a risk register, if you have charted out your risks and you kind of know what you're going to deal with, you can have some tools that are there to help you manage those risks if and when they arise so that you're prepared. Because on one of our projects, time is everything. So if you don't have a tool on hand or you don't have a strategy on hand, then it takes you a week or a month to figure it out. That may push that project well over in terms of budget and schedule. And in the world that we live in, that means you may never get another project from that client. And that can really have a major negative impact on your company long term. So you really need to prepare. And I like Zach's approach of thinking about having some tools internally to help you to be very versatile in managing and dealing with different risks that you encounter. So certainly, Zach, safety is of the utmost importance on all of our projects. And for you, on your projects, working pads are really essential for equipment stability and site safety on your sites. What are some of the key factors that you consider when designing and implementing working pads into your projects?
Yeah, the first factor there is understanding what the existing soil is, what the future site grades are going to be, and then what is below that surface. Depending on how soft it is or maybe unstable, then you can design from there. How much improvement needs to be done for that working platform to support what at times can be very large, top-heavy machines drilling into that ground, and any unevenness or softness where the machine is rutting, potentially, digging in on one side can lead to a massively large problem. So you want to make sure that you understand what is underneath the ground surface and what are you bringing to that site. Obviously, different types of rigs, whether they're large or small, require different types of planning for that ground and improvements required. So making sure that you understand how soft it is, how heavy the machine is that you're bringing, and what improvements need to be made prior to actually landing that machine is very important.
So again, not all of your working ground improvement projects and have working pads on your projects, but you probably do have some kind of stabilization routine that you need to go through on your project to ensure safety or ensure that your project gets off on the right foot, right? So you need to think through what that entails. In Zach's case, working pads is a piece of that. So really needs to understand the site and what goes into it. In your case, maybe that's something else, right? For example, when I worked in site design, one of the things that we need to usually start with is getting a good survey of the property. If we don't have a good survey of the property, we don't know the terrain. Like I said earlier, we don't know if there are easements involved. We don't know where we can hook up our utilities, right? We have to know if there's a safe entrance onto the site, a construction entrance onto the site. Where are we going to put that? That's a critical piece of information. So, again, the more information you have about your project up front, that you can minimize risks with information because that information allows you to better equip yourself for any risks that may arise. And I can't really stress this enough, but we interview a lot of project managers on this show. We build a lot of custom project management development programs for companies. So we're interviewing their PM leaders. And the one thing that they say most is that most project managers don't plan enough for risks. They're not proactive enough when it comes to risk planning. They jump into the project without considering them. So going through that risk process is really important, which is why we kind of wanted to talk to Zach about some of these things and get some examples of some ways that you can prepare for that. All right, Zach. So now it's time for our final question, which we call the PM pitfalls question. What would you say is one of the bigger project management pitfalls that you've seen in our industry? And how would you recommend that a PM avoid it, overcome it, or deal with it for those PMs listening?
Yeah, I think that it's multifaceted. The main thing is, like I said, proper planning and communication, but also just asking questions. From the minute that you arrive at that job or given that job and you become part of that team, after the job is sold and been vetted, you need to ask questions. What is the access? What's nearby? Are there airports, utilities? Who else is working on this job site? But asking questions and really peeling back the job from start to finish is a big it's a major necessity in then beginning that planning and communication process. Secondly, is as part of that process is making sure that both your own crew and your client's crew have a good understanding of how that job is going to flow and an agreement, because maybe both parties have an understanding, but they're both not in agreement, and that can cause conflict down the road. So, like I said, number one is ask every question. No question is dumb. It just helps both parties understand what is going to happen next, and then making sure that both parties are in agreement on what that plan is.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that miscommunication is probably one of the biggest PM pitfalls or assumptions from people. So to Zach's point, if we can do some proactive planning around these things, like a scope change process, for example, talking to your client ahead of the project. If the scope changes on the project or if there's an addendum needed, how are we going to handle that? Right? What does that process look like? Who do I need to talk to in your organization? So I think the more planning you can do ahead of your projects, you're just going to save yourself down the road because things are going to go wrong. Changes are going to happen on your project. Risks are going to come about like we talked about. These aren't ifs, they're pretty much when in the type of work we do. So the better equipped you are to deal with them, the better equipped you will be to make your project kind of, as I say, land on time and on budget. All right. So with that, once again, Zack Kovacs, Regional Operations Manager at Menard USA. Zack, I just want to thank you for joining us on the AEC PM podcast and sharing some of the ways that you plan for and manage risk on your projects.
No, thank you very much for having me, Anthony.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Zack. I know that he works in the soil space, but it doesn't matter. Risks happen on every project. You have to learn to identify them, rate them in terms of their impact and probability, and figure out how you can mitigate them before you start your project. And I hope that this conversation helped you to do just that. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help architects, engineers, and construction professionals become better project managers. I'll see you next week.